Siberia. The name evokes cold, remoteness, and above all else, size. Siberia is vast and nearly empty. It stretches almost 5,000 miles from the Ural Mountains in the east to the Pacific coast in the west. With Siberia, Russia is the largest country in the world. When the sun sets on its western border in Europe, it rises on its Pacific coast, 11 time zones away. Siberia is uniquely blessed. Its forests are as abundant as South America's. Beneath its majestic landscape and wide rivers lies a treasure of oil, diamonds, and gold. A land of contrasts, Siberia's countryside is dotted with picturesque villages, but the landscape is also littered with the debris of the Soviet Union's passage, polluted cities, gulag prison camps, and environmental devastation. This is the story of Siberia. How the East was won. Russia conquered Siberia in the early 17th century. In doing so, it became a country of excess and mystery. Part European, part Asian, part civilized, part wild frontier.
Siberia is seen as really the epitome of the Russian soul in many respects. It encapsulates everything that Russians see in themselves as a hardy, sturdy people of the north who can overcome great challenges and great suffering and yet still live on as a nation.
Like the conquest of the American West, Siberia's tale has become the stuff of legend. Siberia was Russia's great frontier, there for the taking. It was settled by adventurers in search of riches, the oppressed seeking freedom, and the land-hungry poor.
Siberia is seen as the heartland of Russia. It was always seen as the land of opportunity, like in the United States and the West, that this was kind of the way that you could redeem and reinvent yourself and basically find a new life.
When Russians first scouted Siberia in the 15th century, they didn't find an empty land. Siberia was sparsely filled with about 250,000 tribal peoples.
There were maybe 24 different nationalities. There were peoples, you know, all the way from the Arctic coast right down to the Mongol steppe.
No one is sure how or when, but Siberia's indigenous peoples are thought to have migrated from the south. What we do know is that they share a common ancestry with Native American Indians. It is thought early Siberians were the first Americans. 20,000 years ago, they migrated across a now vanished land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska. The indigenous peoples of Siberia differ in language and culture, but they shared a nomadic lifestyle based on hunting, fishing or herding, and shamanism.
The central figure of shamanism is the shaman, and what he does is go on a soul journey, which means that he works himself into a trance. In that trance, he becomes a seagull who can fly or a wolf who can run fastest, and he will go and fight the shaman's spirits of enemy tribes or bring the walrus nearer the coast or fight off disease.
It was in the 16th century that Cossack armies, led by the legendary warrior Yermak, began the conquest of Siberia. They swiftly crushed the native tribes in their path. The Cossacks were originally serfs, freed from bondage in exchange for a vow of undying loyalty to the Tsar. In a remarkable feat, these fierce fighters reached the Pacific in less than 70 years and turned Siberia into Russia's backyard. The Cossacks went to Siberia for furs, especially sable, in great demand among Europe's fashion-conscious nobility.
The motivation behind the Russian conquest was really purely economic. It was a fur rush. The price of furs shot up in the 16th century. They were there after sable, primarily. Squirrel, wolf, fox, but mostly sable.
The Cossacks, in the name of the Tsar, imposed an imperial tax on the natives to be paid in fur pelts.
The Russians imposed tribute obligations on them. They would take oaths of loyalty from tribal leaders, and the leaders have to promise to deliver so many sable skins per man per year, on pain of violence.
By the middle of the 17th century, Siberia would provide the Tsar with nearly 7 million sable pelts a year. The pelts were taken abroad and traded for gold. Gold that kept the Russian government afloat, but bled the natives dry.
As the sable gradually got hunted out, fulfilling these obligations got harder and harder for the tribal peoples. They were also enslaved. They also became addicted to alcohol, tobacco, and so on, which Russians started to sell them.
The Tsar rewarded the Cossacks handsomely with Siberian land. They opened the way for the settlers that followed. They were Russia's frontiersmen.
Very similar to the trappers who first settled Canada. They travelled in boats along the rivers, and where the rivers didn't join, they would dismantle their boats and carry them across the bridgehead and then get to the next river and move on. And at the confluences of the rivers, at the strategic points, they built themselves these wooden stockaded forts.
These Cossack frontier posts would turn into small settlements, then towns. They eventually became Siberia's major cities. These are the faces of the Cossacks today. After 75 years of Soviet rule, they are no longer the ferocious fighters that struck fear into the hearts of Napoleon's soldiers. These aging patriots meet weekly under their leader, Vyacheslav Krivanogov, in this run-down, souvenir-filled room. After awarding themselves some medals, they get down to today's business. A letter to the president requesting the creation of an elite Cossack fighting force. The Cossacks are today a little worse for wear, but still proud. A tattered army in faded, threadbare uniforms, always ready for a parade. In 1917, the Cossacks suffered a cruel reversal of fortune when their benefactor, Tsar Nicholas II, was overthrown in the Communist Revolution. Over 500,000 Cossacks then lived in Siberia, and they remained loyal to the crown.
The story of the Cossacks represents one of the most tragic chapters in Russia's history. The Cossacks were warriors, they guarded the borders, and above all, they had a close relationship with the Tsar.
In the ensuing civil war, the Cossacks joined the anti-revolutionary white forces. Trapped near the city of Krasnoyarsk, they made a final heroic stand on horseback. Preferring death to surrender, they charged into a hail of machine gun fire. The communists subsequently ordered the elimination of the conquerors of Siberia.
Hundreds of thousands, even millions of Cossacks suffered. To give you an example, to save bullets, they took thousands of Cossacks out to sea, cemented their feet, and threw them overboard. It's the tragic story of our great-grandparents.
Today, the Cossacks are experiencing a revival. They meet regularly at the site of their last stand to celebrate their culture and remember their dead. In a final affront, the Soviet education machine tried to erase the Cossacks from their history books.
To know yourself, you must know your own origins. I did not know my own origins. You see, we were not allowed to know that before. We were supposed to have an unclouded communist future. Everyone was equal. Now we understand that the totalitarian system bled us dry. It bled us dry. Now they could never force us to remove our uniforms and renounce our people.
Today, the Cossacks are pushing for the restoration of the Tsar, a hopeless attempt to turn back the clock to a less troubled time before the Bolsheviks took power. Then, Siberia was the open frontier, a land of boundless opportunity and promise, on its way to becoming a second America. But Russia's wild east would have a different fate. Thanks to the Cossacks, Siberia became part of Russia in 1650. But for almost 250 years, Russia left it largely untouched.
In 1700, in Siberia, there were only about 200,000 people in addition to indigenous peoples. They would live in small settlements, small frontier towns, often move around. And really, there were no big cities that developed in Siberia.
But soon, the Tsars began to force their unwanted into the vastness of Siberia. After the death penalty was abolished and replaced with forced labor in 1753, a bewildering variety of crimes, from wife-beating to fortune-telling, could get you expelled to Siberia. Most sentences stretched from 10 to 30 years, but untold thousands never returned home, dying from disease, famine, or overwork. By the 1917 revolution, 2.5% of the Russian population was either in prison or in exile. Stalin himself was exiled, although he would live under much better conditions than he would later impose on others. Prison labor built Siberia's roads and cities and worked its fields and mines. It secured Siberia's reputation as a land of chains and defined its development. Russian leaders hoped that those expelled to Siberia would both disappear and serve the goal of populating the region.
There was a great deal of paranoia about the development of Siberia. Now, Russia has a long history of invasion. There's been a strong sense of vulnerability and insecurity.
Until the Communist Revolution, Siberia's principal cities were built in the south, where the weather is cold, but tolerable. Today, these cities, like Krasnoyarsk, hold most of Siberia's population. Krasnoyarsk began life in 1628 as a Cossack fort at a strategic location on the Yenisei River. The Yenisei is Russia's Mississippi, stretching 2,500 miles from the mountains of Central Asia to the Arctic Sea. Seen from afar, this city of over 1 million looks like a typical Soviet town. Its skyline is punctuated with smokestacks from run-down factories. Surrounding the city are dilapidated cookie-cutter apartment blocks, examples of the communist-era experiment in planned living. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom. Now, Siberia's adventurers, trappers, and exiles were joined by millions of land-hungry peasants. They trekked eastward in horse-drawn carts, overflowing with family, farm animals, and the essentials of life. And wherever they went, they established countless new frontier towns. This is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It doesn't seem in any way special, just an ordinary Russian train, but it changed the region's destiny forever. Modeled on America's Union Pacific Railway, the Trans-Siberian was built between 1891 and 1903.
Part of the rationale of building the Trans-Siberian was to be able to facilitate the movement of people further east, to really consolidate Russia's sovereignty over this vast territory.
The Trans-Siberian Railroad is the spinal column of Siberia, connecting major cities along its southern rim. Along its path today, village after village glides past in endless procession. It is the timeless Russia one has always imagined. The Trans-Siberian is the longest railroad in the world. If you board the train in Moscow, you will reach Vladivostok on the Pacific coast in 6 days, 4 hours, and 40 minutes. Before it was built, crossing Russia from west to east meant taking a horse-drawn carriage over often snowed-in dirt roads, a bone-rattling ride that could last nearly a year. Even today, no intercontinental highway exists in Russia. In November 1912, just 5 years before the Russian Revolution, U.S. Army Major General Adolphus Washington Greeley, Civil War veteran and Arctic explorer, became one of the few Westerners to journey on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. In an article for National Geographic entitled "The Land of Promise," Greeley described his amazement by what he saw at Siberia's train stations.
Immigrants by the hundreds swarmed over and around the station. Men and women in the flush and vigor of life, gay and careless youth, the aged bordering on the verge of the grave, and the tiny babe at its mother's breast.
The Trans-Siberian opened up Siberia. What was a trickle of immigrants became a torrent. From 1885 to the revolution in 1917, it brought nearly 5 million immigrants to Siberia. All along its path, new towns cropped up. Older towns like Krasnoyarsk became cities. Major Greeley concluded that Siberia was a place where abundant natural resources and massive immigration would transform Russia into a land of wealth and prosperity, a second America.
Our journey across Siberia confirmed the opinion of the author that no other country approaches Russia in the extent of its territory, the diversity of its people, or in the variety of its climates, and further, created the belief in its unsurpassable superiority as to the latent and fast-developing productivity of its agricultural, forest, and mineral resources.
A passenger disembarking today in Novosibirsk, Siberia's largest city and its capital, would see a scene filled with the diversity of Siberia's people. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Siberia is again on the move. The station, as in Greeley's day, is bustling with activity. Many are peddlers heading to the local markets to sell their goods. Siberia's markets are noisy and, above all, colorful, a crossroads of the peoples of the former Soviet Union. The men look unkempt, and the women stoical. The transition from communism to capitalism was brutal for many of Siberia's peoples. Highly educated professionals lost jobs and security overnight. They turned into faceless, so-called shuttle traders, commuting between Siberia's cities and China or Central Asia, buying cheap goods and carrying them to markets to sell at a small profit. What separates what Greeley saw nearly a century ago from today is 75 years of Soviet power. The conquest of the East would coincide almost exactly with the communist seizure of power.
It's true to say that the conquest of the East in Russia and the conquest of the West in the United States took place in a similar time period. They both actually started in around the 1880s and the 1890s. In Russia, however, the bulk of the conquest of the East was carried out in the Soviet period, really from the 1920s.
Greeley's optimistic predictions about Siberia's future wouldn't be borne out.
It's definitely the Soviet phenomenon that ruined the development of Siberia, because the Soviet Union really used the Gulag, the prison labor camp system, to colonize and industrialize and urbanize Siberia in a fashion that was unprecedented either in Russian history or anywhere else in the world.
Siberia today is a land with a tragic past and a problem-riddled present. Greeley's land of promise became a land whose promise was not fulfilled. Only today is Russia recovering. But to really understand Siberia, one must first understand the Gulag. Krasnoyarsk is today a town of rising prosperity, striving for normality. But Krasnoyarsk was once a closed military city with a dark past. Gulag prisoners built the town's infrastructure and worked in its military factories. Today's lesson at this local high school is being given by an invited guest, Alexei Babi, head of the local chapter of Memorial, a human rights organization. Today's subject, the Gulag.
Imagine yourself in a camp with several thousand people, in the middle of winter without any food to eat at all.
The kids listen mildly bored as the human rights campaigner in his oversized glasses and ill-fitting suit tries to keep their attention. They think he's a relic of the past. In fact, they know little of their own history. When Lenin and his Bolsheviks took power in 1917, revolution and civil strife ravaged Russia and Siberia. Farms and companies were destroyed. Poverty and famine gripped the country. Millions died. When Stalin consolidated Soviet power after Lenin's death in 1924, he solidified a diabolical system based on terror. He set up thousands of slave labor camps in Siberia, the Gulag. Consumed by paranoia, he filled them with millions of his real and imagined enemies. Siberia's fate was sealed.
If you look at people coming in and going out, you get a number more like about 18 million people who passed through the camp system. My guess is something like people who died directly in the camps is probably 3-4 million. And then you have to add to that people who died before they got to the camps, who were murdered either in prison or in mass execution squads. And then I'm sure you get at least another million, maybe more. That's not counting famine, that's not counting collectivization, that's not counting people who died in the Civil War. If you add all the numbers together, we can easily get 15 million, 18 million people. The Gulag and the Holocaust belong in the same category of historical events.
But in comparison to the Holocaust, Stalin's crimes have received little attention. At Memorial's office in Krasnoyarsk, Alexei Babi leafs through a large collection of photos, just a fraction of those condemned by Stalin to Siberia.
Rodion Petrovich Liber.
This is Rodion Petrovich Liber. He's one of the few who resisted. When he heard the lies of his accusers, he decided to defend himself. While he was being questioned, he grabbed the interrogator's pistol and shot him. He shot several KGB men who ran into the room. He shot until there were no bullets left. Then he was, of course, shot himself.
But the main purpose of the Gulag was not to mass-produce corpses. It was economic. Stalin saw Soviet Russia as locked in a life-and-death struggle with capitalist enemies, and he believed that it had to modernize quickly if it was to survive. He was ready to enslave his people in order to propel his country into the modern era.
In the Soviet Union, like in a totalitarian state, people were always last to be valued. It's a characteristic of all totalitarian or authoritarian states, especially big ones with big population, big territory. For them, people is always trashed.
Recognizing Siberia's potential, Stalin launched a crash program of exploitation and forced industrialization. Many of Stalin's camps in Siberia grew into industrial cities, populated by millions forcibly relocated. The Soviet Union thereby colonized vast and inhospitable regions. They were advertised as heroic socialist achievements and symbols of the superiority of the communist system. But ultimately, it did not work.
The Gulag was not economically viable. Because he had slave labor, people were expendable. You could build a city in a necessary place and not particularly calculate the costs. You could dig mines that weren't actually viable, economically viable, because you had slaves who would do it for you. One of the difficulties actually in reforming the Russian economy now is that Russia isn't underdeveloped, it is misdeveloped.
This is Nikita Petrov. He works with Memorial in Moscow.
A suitcase for prisoners of the labor camps in Siberia.
Stalin said one death was a tragedy, but 1 million deaths a statistic. Nikita has dedicated his life to putting a face on the Gulag archipelago.
This is the list that Stalin himself signed to execution. 34,000 of people. Nobody can explain why Stalin executed all this list.
Nikita has assembled hundreds of pages listing the names of the condemned thousands.
For instance,
in Memorial's museum, Nikita shows us drawer after drawer of index cards.
And this is the box with photos.
They are neatly laid out with face after face of victims and executioners. Many of these executioners would themselves be killed to hide the crime, so that they, not Stalin, would take the blame. Their faces would subsequently be scratched out from official photos. Near the Lubyanka, the headquarters of the former KGB in Moscow, is a memorial stone brought from a Siberian prison. Irina Ardinskaya and Susanna Pechora are just two of those who were sent to Gulag camps in Siberia.
Через вот это здание прошли тысячи и
Thousands
тысячи.
and thousands of human sacrifices passed through the Lubyanka, and it's in their memory that this rock was erected.
Этот камень. Я надеюсь, что никогда не наступит.
I hope they'll never remove it, although I fear that appears to be the direction the country is heading.
Мы идем.
Irina, Susanna, and their friends were only 17 and 18 and very naive when they were arrested in 1950. Their crime was to be members of a free-thinking literary club that met in this building to discuss the meaning of life.
Почему меня взяли?
Why was I taken? Well, because I guess I shouldn't have been so smart.
Это назвали антисоветской.
Our group was deemed an anti-Soviet, a Jewish organization.
И
We were all thrown into camps.
посадили.
Today, nearly all trace of the camps has disappeared. One can see a few collapsed barracks and teetering guard towers. Vladimir Florovich, now retired in Krasnoyarsk, was a low-level camp guard. He feels no guilt or remorse and wears his uniform with pride.
Many prisoners would try to get out of work. Sometimes they would put two fingers on a metal rail and sit on them until they got frostbite, which meant, of course, that for 2 months they could rest in the infirmary. Some even went further. They literally mutilated themselves. They would batter themselves to the point where they developed gangrene and had their limbs amputated.
Escape was next to impossible. Barbed wire and guard towers surrounded the camps. But it was Siberia's weather and geography that chained the prisoners in place. Camps were built in remote and isolated sites, freezing, uninhabited wastelands in winter, mosquito-infested swamps in summer. Today, the Gulag is purposefully forgotten. Physical traces of its existence have all but disappeared. But Russia cannot escape its psychological legacy. The Gulag helped give rise to a servile mentality in the Russian people that persists to this day. A fear of power and a conviction that to rule a country, freedom must be restricted. There was a place in Stalin's slave empire that prisoners feared most. This was Kolyma, in Siberia's northeast, the Gulag's heart of darkness. A sentence there meant almost certain death. This is Siberia's Kolyma region, across the Bering Sea from Alaska. When a vast treasure of gold was discovered here in the 1920s, Stalin immediately recognized it as a godsend for his struggling regime. He turned this vast, barren land into a kingdom of slave camps. They extended over a territory the size of Mexico. Its prison bars were the Pacific, the Arctic North, and impassable terrain.
It's a particularly inhospitable part of the world. It's colder than any part of the Soviet Union. It's many 10, 30, 40, 50 degrees below zero in the winter. When it was founded, there was actually nothing there. All the roads, all the cities, every piece of infrastructure there was built by prisoners. And at its height in the 1930s and 1940s, it was almost a separate country, completely inhabited by prisoners and secret policemen and free employees of the camps.
Most who perished were Gulag prisoners who came to Kolyma in the 1930s. But by the end of World War II, they had been joined by prisoners of war and George Bean, an American of Hungarian descent.
I lived here.
George is a retired businessman living in a peaceful suburb near Washington, D.C. Nothing about his affluent home hints at anything but an ordinary American life. But one look at his license plate tells you there's more here than meets the eye.
I am originally from Budapest, Hungary, and I was born in 1928. And my father was a cardiologist. My mother was a housewife. During the war, Hungary was allied with Germany. In 1945, the Soviet army arrived to Budapest. And Christmas time, the circle around Budapest closed down.
George Bean is but one of millions sent to perish in Kolyma. Luckily, he was not ground into historical dust and lived to tell his story, even write a book about it.
2 NKVD officers showed up in our apartment, and they said that they are looking for my father. They said, then you come with us too. We kissed my mother, my sister goodbye. This was the last I saw my mother for 10 years, and my father never returned.
George, only 17, was sentenced to 8 years in Kolyma.
They asked me the question, what kind of a spy organization member was I? And I told him, this is nonsense. They were paranoid. They rather have 100 innocent arrested than one would go unpunished.
Between 1931 and Stalin's death in 1953, 2 to 3 million people died in Kolyma or on the way there. They died at the calculated rate of 1 life per kilogram of gold. The Trans-Siberian Railroad, once a train of promise for millions of immigrants, had become a prison train.
We were put in cattle cars, about 50 to a cattle cars, and we didn't know where we're going. Thirst. Thirst. This is what I remember from that trip. Not hunger, thirst.
At one point, the train stopped. The dead were taken off, and the prisoners allowed to wash.
They just threw them out and they buried them in the snow. My clothes was not washed since my arrest, and everything was rags on me, and lice. Lice was all over, the scratches all over in your skin.
The train kept heading east, seemingly forever, until it reached a port on the Pacific coast where they were taken off and put into barracks.
There was no bathroom. It was a big circle, and 20,000 people did their thing over there. And people were so weak, they fell in there. And nobody cared. I looked myself up. How do I look? My face was completely all bones. And I was terrified. And they say I am a walking skeleton. I felt isolated, lonely, forgotten, not knowing the future, not knowing what will happen tomorrow, and why I have to die so young.
George and the other prisoners were packed into cargo ships that had been turned into slave ships. They were being taken to the prisoner-built capital of Kolyma, Magadan.
They took us in the hold of this ship. Originally it was cold, we froze to death. And the more people they crammed in there, the more hot it got. 6,000 people were jammed into this. After a while it got so hot, you were almost naked, essentially. 5 days, no water. Everything is quiet in there, even the criminals. We didn't know when we're going to arrive. I was in a complete delirium.
George made it to Magadan. Others were not so fortunate. In 1933, one slave ship got stuck in the ice. Trapped for the winter, thousands died. The guards fed the corpses to the living or pitched them overboard onto the ice. In the 1930s, a succession of prisoners constructed the Kolyma nightmare under harrowing conditions. The first to arrive built Magadan and its port. Survivors and later arrivals built the road to the mines, the infamous Kolyma Highway, the road of bones. During the Second World War, prisoners worked the mines for 14 hours a day in weather that was often so cold, spit froze in midair. Wearing only tattered shoes and stuffed jackets, they were pushed to meet inhuman work quotas. If they failed, their meager rations would be reduced on the principle that those who don't work don't eat. Escape was impossible.
People would try to escape from places like Kolyma. There would be 3 people, for example, and 2 of them would agree in advance that the third one was food.
George arrived in Magadan in the late 40s, when conditions, while still awful, had improved.
You walk off the ship on a plank, and then you walk into the snow. Here, the whole 6,000 people just went like mad, started to eat snow. In my nightmares, these overcrowdings and the lack of water and thirst, this is what comes back all the time.
Miraculously, a kind-hearted nurse at great personal risk had him classified as an invalid. She saved George from certain death.
They never had to go deep in the mines. I tried to find her after I got released, never could. I was working in the factory.
After finishing his 8-year sentence, George was finally freed and allowed to return to Hungary. He eventually escaped to the United States. Almost 50 years later, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian government, in an official letter, acknowledged its mistake in sending him to Siberia. There would be no compensation. Not much remains of the mining camps in Kolyma today, just ruins picked over by scavengers. The gold is almost gone. Magadan is economically depressed. Many of the town's 135,000 people are stranded here. Many of Stalin's Siberian Gulag camps would become closed, hidden cities, concealing some of the greatest secrets of the Soviet Union. The regime stamped its reality on the face of Siberia by building cities that were sealed off from the outside world, or whose existence was a closely guarded secret. Many were built in harsh, cold, inhospitable locations, either to hide military programs or to be next to strategic mineral deposits.
Places like Canada that have similar climatic and geographic zones, people have tended to concentrate around the southern borders. There's only a few large cities in really cold areas. In the Soviet period, the government decided there should not be a barrier. What the Soviet Union needed to move towards was an even distribution of population, cities and industry across the whole landmass.
To achieve its objectives, the state decreed the wholesale relocation of mass numbers of people.
Had it not been for the prison camp system, the Gulag, and then by enticing people out with really high wages and other incentives in the 70s and 80s, you would never have the population profile of Siberia that you see today, with about 40 million people living in this area. To subjugate Siberia to communism, that was really where the mistake was made.
The city of Norilsk was built in the 1930s from nothing on the permafrost of the far north. As the possibility of war with Hitler approached in the late 30s, Stalin concluded that the young Soviet Union had to have a source of strategic minerals critical for building weapons. When rich deposits of nickel and other metals were discovered in a remote, nearly impenetrable part of Arctic Siberia, Stalin dictated the building of a new city to wrench them from the frozen earth, Norilsk. 350,000 slave laborers were forcibly transported here in the 1930s and 40s.
They were sent there in an incredible display of Stalin's cruelty and resourcefulness. He just arrested all the leading metallurgists he needed from all over Russia and sentenced them to long sentences in Norilsk in the most horrific conditions. But it worked. They did it. It's amazing what he did. And from absolutely nothing in this godforsaken place, they built this industry, and they built the tanks, and they beat Hitler.
But the price of this accomplishment was an estimated 100 to 200,000 dead. With its imposing buildings, Norilsk is today a Soviet-era town of 230,000 frozen in time. Less than 1,500 miles from the North Pole, it is the coldest large city on Earth. Temperatures can drop to -70 Fahrenheit. For 3 long winter months, the town never sees the sun. It also has the dubious distinction of being the most polluted city on Earth. Its plants are so polluted that workers need shots of oxygen.
The ride in from the airport to the city is one of the strangest car rides I've ever taken. It's a kind of a moonscape. And halfway there, there's this huge belching factory that's sending up plumes of filthy smoke. The pollution has been so awful there for so long, trees are literally stunted.
Even today, Norilsk remains a closed city. But shrouded in even greater secrecy, perhaps the greatest secret of the Soviet Union, are the cities the Soviets built in Siberia to develop nuclear weapons. They were cities without names, nor did they appear on maps. They were referred to by post office box numbers such as Krasnoyarsk 26. It wasn't until 1993 that the secret cities exchanged their box numbers for real names. The secret nuclear city Krasnoyarsk 26 is now called Zheleznogorsk. Zheleznogorsk is where Stalin and Khrushchev built a 3,500-room complex hidden inside a granite mountain. Here were placed 3 huge nuclear reactors. They produced the tons of plutonium needed to make over 10,000 atomic bombs. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union successfully hid, even from American satellites, what was going on in this Siberian city of 100,000.
The Soviet Union was a very secretive state. There was no freedom of mass media, no freedom of information, not just the culture of secrecy, it was a tradition of secrecy, and it was an inherent part of life of a totalitarian state.
But Soviet science was not only applied to destructive purposes. In 1958, Khrushchev decreed the creation of Akademgorodok, Russian for Little Academic City, an improbable dream town devoted to pure science. It was a communist paradise, a Siberian ivory tower where the nation's best minds would come to pursue research for the glory of the motherland. Built in pristine forest in the suburbs of Novosibirsk, this utopian community has parks and gardens, as well as nice housing. All were necessary to attract people to a place where the temperature can fall to -50 degrees.
The Soviet Union provided people with 4 or 5 times the salaries that they got elsewhere in the country. People were given free vacations to the Black Sea or somewhere else that was pleasant in the Soviet Union. They were provided with all their housing, all the other amenities.
At its height in the 1960s, Akademgorodok was home to 200,000 people. The inspiration for Akademgorodok came from the brilliant Russian physicist Mikhail Lavrentiev. He sold Khrushchev on the idea that to overtake America, the Soviet Union had to create a place that would harness the genius of the country's scientists. Khrushchev, a risk-taker willing to try bold projects, loved the idea. When Lavrentiev showed him the spot he'd picked out, Khrushchev, who was fond of saying, "You'd have to be crazy to live in Siberia," now raised his arm and said, "It shall be done." The jewel in the crown was the Institute of Nuclear Physics. Its patron saint was Gersh Budker, a scientist with an outsized personality as engaging as Albert Einstein's. For a few brief years, Akademgorodok lived up to Lavrentyev's dream and was an island of heady intellectual freedom. In 1968, Akademgorodok was the Soviet Union's Berkeley, home of its summer of love. There were parties, bohemian cafes, protest movements, and folk song festivals featuring protest singers.
We've always valued our freedom here. We invited poets, famous singers, and songwriters. The party henchmen, I remember, were always trying to get their hands on us, but Lavrentiev shielded us. He said, "Hey, they're young."
But this brief moment of freedom did not last. In 1964, Leonid Brezhnev deposed Khrushchev, and the political climate began to change. Free thinking was out, conservative orthodoxy was back, and Akademgorodok's days of freedom were numbered. When protest letters were signed in favor of dissidents like Sakharov, the authorities cracked down.
But things became more difficult under Brezhnev. Letters of protest were being circulated. Budker didn't want to sign. He wanted to, but he was afraid of the consequences because naturally, it would have meant the demise of the Institute of Physics.
Today, Akademgorodok, while greatly diminished, is still intact as a science city. Its once pampered academic population has been cut in half. The average age of its scientists has risen from 34 to 57. This is Ivan Lukashenko, a research scientist at the renamed Budker Institute of Physics. Born and educated in Siberia in Soviet times, at 31 he represents a new generation of Akademgorodok scientists. A whole generation of scientists between 35 and 50 was lost in the disorder following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Young talent either went into business or moved abroad. But Ivan has bucked the trend.
Normally, people who move there, they're afraid to move back. They picture Russia worse than it is really. So they still remember, they all immigrated in 91st, 95, some 98. It was a much more difficult life then. Now it's much closer to Western life.
Ivan has stayed in science and in Russia and makes a decent living. He also spends part of his year working in Seattle, but he prefers Siberia.
They always say, "Oh, Siberia, it's so far and so cold." Almost immediately it comes like gulag. When we joke between ourselves, we often say that this is a place to live these days with all global warming and something like that. This is the quietest place, no hurricanes, and actually a good place to live, except mosquitoes in the summer.
Today, the Institute of Physics has learned to replace contracts from the military and government with revenues from commercial ventures with foreign firms. The money is used to support Gersh Budker's original mission, research in pure physics. In a strange twist of fortune that would make Khrushchev turn in his grave, Akademgorodok has become a fashionable place to live. Picturesque villas that once housed famous professors are now owned by Russia's newly affluent middle class. Today, Akademgorodok and Siberia are making a comeback. But this new prosperity is fueled by a now familiar story of exploitation. Life in the south of Siberia is much like the rest of Russia. It's cold, but it's bearable. To find the Siberia of legend, the merciless cold, the bleakness, you must go north. Russia has more people living in extremely cold areas than any other country in the world. Here is a cold world where towns are built on stilts, where cars have double-pane windows, where roads or railroads are few and far between. But for planes, helicopters, and icebreakers, people are completely isolated.
It takes about 9 hours to fly from Moscow to Anadyr, to Chukotka, say, and 7 of those are over Siberia, and 6 of those, unless you go over the railway to the south, you see nothing. There's no pipelines, there's no roads, there's not a sign of the existence of the human race. It's vast, and most of it is still completely unspoiled.
Buried under the North's frozen soil lies much of Russia's economic future and Siberia's crown jewels: nickel, diamonds, and above all else, oil. The oil and gas industry is critical to Russia and Siberia. It alone accounts for nearly 25% of Russia's gross domestic product. Oil is what keeps Russia afloat.
Oil and gas has always been the mainstay of both the Soviet economy and the Russian economy, and today 1/3 of all Russian government budget revenues come from oil and gas taxes. It's about 50%, even more than 50% now, of Russian exports.
And Russian oil is important for the whole world. Its reserves are second only to Saudi Arabia's. With reduced options elsewhere, oil companies are lining up at Siberia's door, the last oil frontier. This is the Moscow office of Yukos, Russia's most technically innovative and profitable oil company. Yukos alone produces 2% of the world's daily output of oil, as much as Libya.
So this is what we call the FDP Center.
Joe Mock is a seasoned oil man from Oklahoma. He's come to Russia and joined Yukos's management team because, as he likes to say, this is where the oil is.
Yukos is unique in that Yukos brought in 5 years ago quite a few expats. Not a lot, but what's unusual, put them in high-impact positions. We have a simple philosophy all the way.
Joe's office is deceptively empty. But from here and his laptop, this Yukos senior vice president, with his homespun Oklahoma accent, watches over the company's far-flung assets.
What we saw when I first got here was that the Russian wells were way underproduced. So we started out to change that, and you can see Yukos's growth for the last 3 years, and this year was 17.5%, leading the world in growth for the oil business. At the same time, Yukos cut its active well stock by 36%, which is incredible since that production comes from wells.
Yukos inherited a crumbling and inefficient oil infrastructure from the Soviet Union that was in urgent need of modernization. Its American managers have helped transform the company from a wasteful Soviet enterprise into a modern, efficient oil producer. This ultra-modern technical center next to Joe's office employs the latest graphics technology to create geological models of existing and future Yukos oil fields. It's an indispensable tool for the efficient management of the company's oil resources. The room is straight out of Star Trek. From the semicircular table with its leather chairs, Joe and his expat buddies can plot Yukos's transformation into a modern oil company.
We've changed this company more in the years we've been here than I've ever seen a company, or could I imagine a company changing in the West.
This is Yukos country, a large swath of western Siberia dotted with wild east towns. Neftyugansk is its capital. The town of 100,000 and the surrounding region are floating on an ocean of oil, a significant part of Russia's reserves. Yukos's main oil field, Priobskoye, is about 60 miles from Neftyugansk. It can be reached by road, but helicopter, like this Soviet-era workhorse, is the preferred means of transportation. From the air, one can see the immensity of a Siberia that still looks pristine. Oil was found in Priobskoye in the early 60s, deep underground, where geological conditions made it hard to retrieve. The oil-dependent Soviet Union rushed its development using substandard equipment.
There was a great deal of waste because, of course, there was no price associated with these assets, and the imperative was on pumping out as much oil and gas as possible for export. There was a great deal of depopulation of the environment as a result of leaks of oil and flaring off of gas.
Years later, oil companies like Yukos would have to make huge investments in state-of-the-art equipment to extract the oil efficiently. The field is currently estimated to hold about 4 billion barrels of oil, making it one of the largest underdeveloped fields in the world. Patrick Griffin is what you'd call a well doctor, maintaining the pumps and motors his American company sells to Yukos. A veteran of the U.S. Army's Special Forces, Patrick has worked in harsh conditions all over the world, and he rates Siberia as one of his toughest assignments. The Russians want to get the oil out as if there's no tomorrow. They push their people and equipment to the limit and beyond.
The well we're going to has been a problem well. It has a lot of sand in it, so it's a real harsh well condition. You need to bring it on slow, and they didn't. So they're filling our pumps up with sand, and they're locking up and they're freezing, and which means I have to go out and start it, and I have to give it what's called a hard start.
Unlike Russian workers, Patrick gets to live in a relatively comfortable room in Priopskoy town.
I was told that not by any of my bosses, but by different people, that Yukos was a real difficult company to work with. The first 2 weeks, they were real difficult because they were working me to death. It sucks. Well, we did an install 2 weeks ago, and it was, what, minus 34? And it was snowing.
The rig crews work 12-hour shifts for 6, even 7 days a week, usually for 2 weeks straight. Then they take 1 or 2 weeks off in Nefteyegansk.
This crew is a pretty good crew. Very, very hard working. And they don't mind the cold, and I'm freezing.
Russian workers are paid about $700 a month, several times the national average. For this, they are prepared to live on site in old trucks that have been converted into trailers and work in blizzards if necessary. Yukos has spent lavishly on civic programs, an effort many locals see as an attempt to buy them off. At this school, Yukos has paid for new facilities and computers. The company also sponsors scholarships and future jobs for the best students. But the locals know most of the oil profits are taken out of the region. Many of these school kids are just looking for a one-way ticket out of town.
In Moscow, many people don't even know what this town is. They haven't even heard about this town. As it's so small, it's in deep Siberia. It's difficult to understand for those people that we can live here in this village. Next year, I hope I'll be able to live in Moscow. So I'll leave this place.
Life can get boring in Nefteyegansk, especially during the long, sunless winter months. People find escape through television or a few shots of vodka. In these confusing times of change and commercialism, many Siberians have found solace in religion. Siberia, like the rest of Russia, has experienced a religious revival since the end of the communist regime and the demise of its atheist dogma. People are reverting to their cultural and religious roots. Baptisms and religious weddings are in great demand. Today, burgeoning demand for oil and the profit motive means that Yukos and other oil companies are expanding into new tracts at breakneck speed. They reap the riches, but it comes at a heavy price, a price paid by Siberia's native peoples.
Tomorrow in history, the sudden sinking of the marine.
Near Nefteyegansk is one of the region's saddest places. This replica of a Khanty village. But instead of evoking the folkloric past, this rarely visited site only heightens one's sense of loss for a now nearly vanished Siberian way of life. The Khanty, an ancient tribal people, are employees here play-acting at their own rituals. But the harder they try, the more hollow the experience feels. Still, they persist, hoping to bring in a few rubles. Zoya Lisova works at the museum. Her life mirrors the Khanty's transformation over the last 50 years.
My people are from nomadic camps in the Neft-Lugansk region. My mother still lives there, and I grew up there.
The region's remote location, deep in Siberia's interior, shielded the Khanty's way of life for centuries. Zoya's life in her native village was traditional. The Khanty were reindeer herders who led their reindeer flocks from pasture to pasture. They held the land as sacred and left each place they pitched their tents as pristine as they found it. Khanty life was built around the reindeer. The animal provided everything. Its skin gave shelter against the coldest blizzard. Its bones were turned into tools for cutting or needles for sewing. It provided transportation, even entertainment. And of course, every bit of it can be eaten. Even the internal organs, the heart and blood, are a real treat. When Stalin came to power, many native leaders believed the revolution's promise of freedom and petitioned him for independence. Instead, Stalin had them arrested and exiled, claiming they were organizing counter-revolutionary resistance. This 1936 poster of Stalin shows a beloved leader being hugged by a 4-year-old native girl, the daughter of a native leader.
It's this famous picture called "We Thank Our Dear Comrade Stalin for Our Happy Childhood." It hung in every schoolroom. 2 years later, both her parents were shot.
The death blow for the natives came when Stalin decreed the collectivization of agriculture and the Russification of native peoples. These proud tribes, who for millennia had wandered the Siberian taiga and tundra freely, were now forced onto collective farms. With their freedom taken away, their culture withered.
Collectivization reached right out to the sort of, the tiniest little settlement. You got protest killing of reindeer in large numbers. The deer were no longer being properly looked after, and you got widespread famine.
The Russians, and more so the Soviets, saw assimilating the Khanty and other tribes as part of their civilizing mission.
Peoples were forcibly removed from their traditional settlements into newly built Soviet-style settlements, and it was a disaster. The factories that they were forced to go and work in were fundamentally uneconomic. Their children were sent away to boarding schools, to Russian-speaking boarding schools. Families broken up, and people just lost hope in these places.
Zoya was taken from her parents and forced to attend a Russian school. But she says she has no regrets.
I lived in a small settlement made up of 4 or 5 families. Like others before us, we were obliged to send our children to a Russian village with a children's home and school. Of course, when you are taken away from your family at age 7, you feel homesick for your land and family. But then you grow used to it and see it as normal.
50 years ago, before the discovery of oil, it was still possible to find Khanty communities speaking their own language. Sadly, their pastures turned out to be above one of the world's richest oil deposits.
I remember being in the camps with my parents at the age of 6 or so, just as the industrialization of the North was starting. I remember an expedition came through to do surveillance work. I went with my father to see what they were doing. There were cans and trash all over the place. And most importantly, we saw that reindeer bones were scattered everywhere. The preparation had been done carelessly, and some of the bones still had pieces of meat stuck to them. Seeing something like that hurt my child's soul and affected my feelings towards Russians.
Following the surveillance teams came the Soviet oil industry with its huge support infrastructure, derricks, roads, refineries, and towns. They would start destroying the region's delicate ecological balance.
I remember one summer when some tame reindeer were milling around our home. When we got closer, we saw that the mother reindeer was lying on the ground, unable to get up, and the baby reindeer was running around it. The mother reindeer couldn't even make a sound. The reindeer, of course, feed on moss, and moss absorbs all the oil and they die as a result. My father killed the mother reindeer to spare it from suffering. For several weeks, the baby continued to run around the area.
The equipment the Soviets installed when Zoya was a child is now antiquated and leaking. While oil companies are today more mindful of the environment, the continued frenzy of extraction is further disfiguring the face of Siberia. Spectacular accidents occur on a regular basis. Leaks are melting the permafrost and poisoning the water. Gas flaring is polluting the air, and migrating birds die in the flames. Some Khanty, like Zoya, are completely assimilated, but many others eke out a living in remote northern settlements. Except for a few, there is no return to a traditional way of life. Reindeer pasture lands are fouled almost beyond repair. Fishing is the only alternative, but what's caught can't compete with the canned goods of the multinational fisheries.
My brother didn't want to go to school. He wanted to fish and hunt. You used to have a choice, but now you don't, because it's impossible to survive that way. My father, who was a fisherman, used to bring in fish by the ton, and there was demand for it. He was paid, and the fish was sent out somewhere to be processed. With this money, he could feed his family. He never had to ask anyone for anything. Then industrialized fishing appeared, and now there's nowhere to sell the fish. You can peddle it at the market, but how much can you sell there? That's life now, very hard. There's no money now, and we don't know what to do.
Fishing villages today have fallen into a sorry state, more akin to rural slums than tranquil oases of a traditional way of life.
You've got whole communities where traditional skills have been totally lost, awful social degradation, and no hope whatsoever.
The people have been reduced to a state of misery. They're desperate to get out. When the occasional helicopter arrives with provisions and their welfare payments, they storm the craft, shoving each other aside, trying to get on and leave. No less than the natives, millions of Russians are today frozen in place in the north of Siberia. They are 10 million strong. The descendants of those forced there by Stalin are encouraged to come by his successors.
There's no other country in the world where a huge swathe of the population has deliberately been moved out into such cold and distant areas. On an unprecedented scale, people move from warmer areas to progressively colder areas in the Soviet Union, which is the exact opposite of trends anywhere else in the world.
In Soviet times, supplies had to be, and still have to be, flown or shipped in at great expense to these remote settlements. Maintaining the North would come to represent 7% of the Soviet Union's gross domestic product. When the Soviet Union ended, prices were freed, and the cost of necessities like food, medical supplies, and fuel immediately shot up. Keeping the distant north from starving or freezing to death has become a huge drain on state coffers. It has been estimated that it would be cheaper to put up those stranded up north in 5-star hotels in Moscow.
It was the misguided development of Siberia that turned it into a curse. There are perhaps as many as 15 million too many people living today in Siberia. That's based on the economic viability of the region, the natural resource base. Now, many people would say, well, how can that be? Look at all the vast natural resources in Siberia. Well, Canada and the United States have similar resource bases in remote areas, but neither of those countries built huge cities right next to these natural resources to exploit them.
When the Iron Curtain fell in 1991, the problems of the modern world swept across Siberia's newly opened borders. The most ominous is HIV/AIDS. The disease is spreading more rapidly in Siberia than almost anywhere else in the world.
From the early 90s, there were maybe 10,000 HIV cases registered. Now there are over 300,000 registered. Anecdotal figures could be 5 to 10 times the 300,000.
Nearly 10% of Siberia's population could be infected within 10 years. Siberia's future depends on the answer to the question, can history's biggest epidemic be stopped here? Siberia today suffers from a litany of social ills, from poverty to divorce to crime and drug addiction.
Society during the transition period has been hit very hard. People have lost everything. They have lost their jobs. Unemployment has skyrocketed. People have had tremendous difficulties in just surviving, day-to-day surviving for the last 10 years. It was very difficult to live under the Soviet period, but there was a certain level of stability.
This is Sister Christina, a 45-year-old nun from Poland. She and her colleagues run St. Nicholas, a well-kept orphanage for abandoned children here in Novosibirsk. The kids constantly tease Sister Christina about her Polish-accented Russian, but it's obvious they adore her. She and her fellow sisters provide the parental love and care the abandoned children crave.
We truly care about them and give everything that we have. They know I have no married life and that they can call me at any time and ask for help.
There are over 650,000 homeless children in Russia, and the grim, underfunded state orphanages are filled to overcapacity. The mostly compassionate staff are unable to cope. Neglect, even cruelty, are an inevitable consequence. Charitable and religious organizations like St. Nicholas have come to lend a hand. But shame, pride, and Russia's tradition of secrecy have been barriers to providing help. The orphanage and the nuns have experienced hostility.
It's because we're Catholic and foreign that we've had a difficult time. They tried to throw mud on us because they thought we'd turn the children into Catholics. No one will force them to change their faith. We've had to fight to gain acceptance.
Most of the children at St. Nicholas have not lost their parents. They're here because their families can't take care of them. Many, like Natasha and Syusha, are children of alcoholics.
I was taken here because my mother drank. Then she died.
Natasha came to St. Nicholas when she was 9. She returned later to live with her father, but he too then drank himself to death.
My father and mother had died and we buried them. I was taken away and brought here.
Telling her story in a barely audible voice, Syusha can still remember the many homeless children in her neighborhood.
A lot of homeless children were wandering around. They slept in entranceways and begged for food. They went door to door trying to get even a little piece of bread, but no one would give them anything.
At age 7, Syusha lost her mother.
When I was still living at home with mother and father, I went to my friend's house. When I came back, mother was sleeping. I asked father, what happened? He said that she'd been drinking and was sleeping. The next day I came in and she was lying in the same position. I said, what happened to mother? She's sleeping, he said. Then I came back and she wasn't there. I asked father where mother was. He said she was taken to the hospital.
When her mother died, her father abandoned her. She's one of the lucky few to be sent here and not to a state institution.
I was told that in other shelters they beat the children and they swear for no reason. And the children, they swear back. Nurses also play favorites, giving some whatever they need, while others, they get nothing.
Sister Christina's one great fear is that the boys will turn to crime and the girls to prostitution after they leave the children's home.
We want to educate these children about moral and ethical rules, about maintaining a pure heart and living a holy life. Of course, we can't keep them all from trouble, but if even 50% of them can live in society, it's worth it.
Here in Krasnoyarsk and all over Siberia, drug use and prostitution have exploded, and they bring with them a grave threat: HIV/AIDS. This is Dr. Julia Pavlova. She's a strong-willed, one-woman campaign to bring awareness of AIDS to Krasnoyarsk's thousands of street prostitutes, most of whom are drug users. 3 times a week, Julia and her friend Lena, a former prostitute and drug addict, take their women's bus out to the streetwalkers to hand out condoms, take blood tests, explain safe sex practices, and listen to their problems. 75% of the girls are drug users, and at least 40% are HIV positive.
We give out condoms and syringes and refer these girls to medical specialists. We help them get medical attention, usually unavailable to them because they don't have residence permits and insurance.
Remote and sheltered behind the Iron Curtain, Siberia considered itself immune to the problems of the West. When it opened up in 1991, freedom came accompanied by the social ills of modern Western society, including drug addiction. Many of Siberia's susceptible youth have picked up the fatal habit. Unaware of the dangers of sharing needles, HIV infection is spreading among them like wildfire. Many of the girls turn to prostitution to support their drug habit. They became the bridge for the spread of the disease to the general population. Once almost non-existent, HIV/AIDS is now growing faster here than anywhere else in the world. The red light district in Krasnoyarsk is a miles-long seedy road on the outskirts of town, lined with abandoned Soviet-era factories and patrolled by low-life pimps.
The nurse is here, and you can give a blood sample. You know what to do. Please, get into the van. Come on.
Lena once worked this street. The girls trust her.
Have you used drugs for a long time?
Yes, for a long time.
Okay, we'll need to run some tests. You can come tomorrow from 2 to 3, so you won't have to come in the morning. You won't need any documents.
The street girls, usually the product of broken families and poverty, see commercial sex work as the only way to survive and pay for their habit. Some of the girls are single mothers with nowhere else to turn.
I remember a working girl who had 3 children. She had no one to leave her children with, so they would wait by the side of the road while she got in a car with a client. And on top of that, she was 8 months pregnant. I can't imagine anything more tragic.
The Krasnoyarsk region's only AIDS clinic is an unmarked building hidden in a courtyard. The medical staff runs thousands of tests a year. They are disturbed by the rapid rise in positive results. If nothing is done, recent studies suggest, deaths from AIDS in Russia will, under the most optimistic scenario, increase from the current 500 a month to 21,000 a month in 2020.
Here we're talking about drugs, sex, and death. And most societies are not very comfortable talking about things like that. In addition to that, there is a misperception that most of the people who are currently affected, these injecting drug users, that these are social outcasts, these are the dregs of the society. It is wishful thinking for the government of the country or for the intellectual elite in the country to believe that this is a problem that is confined and will remain confined to a marginalized group of the society, and that as such it can be ignored.
Even the staff of the AIDS clinic told us that AIDS does not belong in a film about Siberia.
There's also the sense, which is sometimes spoken and sometimes unspoken, that Russia is a great power and is a much greater society than those that have been affected by the HIV epidemic in a very severe way.
Russia's opening has hit Siberia hard, but amidst the ruin, there's a sense of promise. A new hope has returned to Siberia.
Conspiracy
is a confusing kaleidoscope of untouched beauty and environmental degradation, rich and poor, opportunity and hopelessness. Robert Kaiser of the Washington Post has reported on Russia for decades.
Every big city now and every community in Russia has its own reality. I decided when I was young and was there in the early 70s, you could say, you know, what's going on in the Soviet Union? Well, you could give an answer. But you can't do that now. There's so many different things going on. There's so many different local, distinct local realities.
Today, Siberia is undergoing radical transformation. While development is uneven and poverty abounds, there's a sense of promise in the air. With 1.5 million inhabitants, Novosibirsk is Siberia's capital and largest city. At the center of town stands a statue of a scowling Lenin, as in every city of Russia. All around it, in an apparent affront, businesses are starting up and clubs are filling up with smartly dressed young people. As Siberia emerges from its historical permafrost, it enters the 21st century as that land of promise General Greeley found way back in 1912, a place whose fabulous potential can help Russia regain the superpower status it lost in 1991.
It's wide open, wide open. I often tell my foreign friends they better hurry because the Russians are developing very quickly.
People like Dmitry Simonenko, Ivan Lukashenko, and Eric Shogrin represent the new Siberia, the new shoots emerging from the rubble of communism. Thanks to them and others, Siberia has become a little less remote.